So hello there and welcome to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast, a show where we take all of the latest news, gossip and events in the world of Formula One and relay that back to you for your listening or viewing pleasure, depending on which platform you choose to follow us on. And this week's episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast, we are going to conduct a bit of a news roundup. Now, this is something we haven't done very often this season. Of course, we've had a lot of races come thick and fast and so many talking points in this championship already. But as we well know, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. So in this episode, we're going to have a little bit of a rundown of some of the big talking points going on at the moment. And of course, let us know what you think of those and please feel free to weigh in. Now, of course, joining me on this episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast, as always, my co-host, Mr. Courtney Pine. Courtney, how are you doing first of all?
You know what? I'm doing great. The season started well, got a close championship battle. And on a personal level, the country's reopening. So things are going really well. And there's certainly a buzz around the UK at the moment.
Certainly is, of course. And always joining us on this episode, a familiar face of the DNF1 family, it's Lee Wallington. Lee, how are you doing this evening? You okay?
I'm okay, thank you. Thank you for having me again. I'm all right. I just wish it stopped raining. Right, it has stopped now, but I want the sun already. Where's summer?
Yeah, the weather's terrible. It's definitely, we want the beer garden weather, but it isn't quite showing its face. Although maybe it's waiting for everything to sort of be opened up a bit more. Not that, you can't already have a drink in a pub outside. You can, but they obviously need the weather to accompany that because it's still a little bit too cold and a bit miserable.
Just the rain.
It is more than anything else. But then it's Britain. What do you expect? Yeah. That's the British summer for you. Anyway, as much as we love to talk about the weather, us Brits, we better start talking about Formula One before people tune off. Speaking of which, of course, just a quick thank you to everybody who has liked our videos and subscribed to the channel. We reached another little milestone. We're past 300 subscribers, which is great stuff for us. And we're really grateful to everybody that has subscribed to the DNF1 channel. If you haven't already and you do enjoy our content, please consider subscribing to the channel. The more of you that subscribe and join our DNF1 family, the more content that we can make for you lovely lots. So please smash that subscribe button and help us get to 1,000 as soon as we can. Plugging aside, let's get to the news roundup. Now, there's so many big talking points in this past week alone, but we're going to start with the champ himself, Lewis Hamilton. Now, of course, if you cast your mind back a few months ago, even before testing, about a week or so before testing, he'd never actually had a contract signed to confirm that he was going to be driving for Mercedes this season, let alone beyond that. Subsequently, he signed a 1-year deal with Mercedes to keep things ticking over. So it kind of gave us the impression that Lewis did have plans to stay on beyond the end of the season. But of course, there was always that shred of doubt that there may come a time where Lewis may say, you know what, I've had my fun. I've had enough. I want to go off and focus on other projects outside of Formula One. As horrible as that may seem to a lot of fans, and probably good news to many other fans, I'm pretty sure, for whatever reason they have. That being said, some rumours have been coming out in the news this past week following the Spanish Grand Prix that Lewis Hamilton wants to sit down in the summer break and discuss the potential of signing a 2-year contract in the summer break, which will take him up to the end of the 2023 season. So first things first, guys, Courtney, upon hearing these rumours starting to build up and the indication that Mercedes do want to keep Lewis on as their number one, I mean, that's got to be fantastic news for the sport and also for Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes fans alike.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you've already said, though, I think there'll be some fans out there who'll be slightly disappointed given how much as Lewis has dominated. But to be honest, I'm not entirely surprised by this news, given the fact that Lewis has been very vocal in how much he's enjoying the new challenge, the new lease of life he's been given by this championship battle with Verstappen. So he's got Verstappen, he could be coming up against in the future. Charles Leclerc, if Ferrari turn it around next season, he's going to be. So Lewis does relish these kind of challenges, and these big regulation changes coming, that alone is a new challenge for him. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. And yeah, I reckon he'll be around for another 2 or 3 seasons.
Yeah, of course, we shouldn't forget how important and significant Lewis is to Formula One. I mean, by far the biggest star in the sport. You probably could argue one of the biggest of all time, almost a celebrity within a sport of stars that you don't necessarily pay much attention to if you're not a fan of the sport. But in Lewis's case, there's a huge exception to that. Lee, I've got to ask, even though we're entering a new era of regulations, and perhaps maybe an appropriate time to herald in a new generation of stars. I imagine it probably doesn't seem right to go into such a huge change that we're coming to in 2022 without the 7, potentially 8-time world champion being a part of it.
Yeah, as I've touched on in previous time you've had me on, that Lewis, last other challenges, Courtney also mentioned, and Lewis, I think he done the recent Pirelli tests a week or so ago. I can't remember the exact date for the new tyres. And you think, when did Lewis actually do a tyre test? He doesn't like testing. He likes to get in the car and race. So it shows you his intention is there to be there. And to the up-and-coming contract discussions that's going on. And Toto has mentioned, he could be around for a while, even into his 40s, which will probably send nightmare to Max, having Lewis around for potentially, if he stayed into his 40s. He's the worst nightmare.
Yeah, absolutely right. And let's not forget, Lewis Hamilton, obviously statistically already the greatest driver of all time. And he's only going to continue to add to those records. He's 2 wins away from the magic 100. Of course, if he wins the championship this season, he will be out on his own ahead of Michael Schumacher as the most successful world champion there is. Not many records left for Lewis Hamilton to achieve that he hasn't already done so. So the motivation has to be there to continue driving. And as you've both rightly pointed out, it may come solely from the promise of competition, this new era that he'll be hopefully heralding with the other stars to try and face a new challenge in any shape or way that comes. And of course, there's no guarantee that Mercedes will have the best car starting next season. And what a prospect that would be if we see Lewis having to really compete with a car much inferior to whatever the leading car is going to be. I mean, let's be honest. We've seen some of the best driving from Lewis Hamilton in previous seasons where his back has been up against it with a new challenge. And at 36 years of age, some may say you might be coming to that period where his levels are dropping. But I'll be honest with you guys, if that's the case, I'm not seeing it. And if it is, Lewis Hamilton's peak is extremely high enough. I mean, I saw a really good analysis from Anthony Davidson following the Spanish Grand Prix, and he made a very good observation where he felt that the battle between Lewis and Max is so much more than the reigning champion versus the up-and-coming star. It was almost like we're seeing Lewis Hamilton now versus a version of Lewis Hamilton when he first was in the sport, where he was very aggressive, going for moves that may end up in a collision. But on top of that, lacking the maturity and the discipline and patience that the Lewis Hamilton of today is so well known for and is so brilliant for. I mean, Courtney, what would you make of comments like that? Do you feel that Max Verstappen is like a Lewis Hamilton that joined the sport back in 2000, or maybe a few years after that in 2012, against the Lewis Hamilton we're seeing today?
Yeah, well, I think with Max, he certainly has like the raw speed. You see it at the start. We've seen it in Imola. We saw it in Spain how Max isn't afraid to get his elbows out, but coming up against someone like Lewis, he knows they can race on that level. I don't think Max will be like that with other drivers. But I think another thing worth bearing in mind with Lewis, and it's something me and you discussed, Adam, previously about a year or so ago, I think the training regimes that he's turned to and the fact that he's become vegan. Now, I'm not going to be vegan anytime soon, so I'm not going on one of those kind of tangents. But I do think the changes in diet and in his training have certainly helped him extend his career.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, let's be honest, these Formula One cars, as difficult as they are to drive, let's not dispute that. They're certainly not as, well, I want to say complicated, but they don't require the brute strength and forces that perhaps the older ones warranted, where you really had to throw them about. That being said, you still have to it still requires a lot of training, a lot of strength, a lot of stamina and all of those things. And at Lewis's age, obviously it's going to be a bit harder for him perhaps than it would be compared to someone like Max, who's in his mid to early 20s. But that being said, it doesn't seem to deter Lewis at all. So, of course, if you are championing something like a vegan diet and the training regime that Lewis has, where he's very much a guy that works hard, but also knows how to relax, that's probably something that he's taken into his more golden years, if you like, and it's paying off for him. Lee, I mean, we mentioned Fernando Alonso before, and obviously there's a fear that perhaps Fernando is not driving to the level that he was known for, or was at his peak. But he's only a few years older than Lewis Hamilton. So why would you, if you can come up with a reason, why would you think that Fernando is struggling to reach his peak, whereas Lewis, who's only a few years younger than him, is still perhaps getting better with age?
I think the issue with Fernando maybe having is you being out of the car for a couple of years, the cars change, the handling changes, obviously the buttons they have on their steering wheel, the engine modes, everything changes even in that short space of time. You just have to look at Esteban Ocon when he came back from his 1 year out. People were talking about how slow he was against Daniel Ricciardo. And now you look at Ocon and at the moment he's smashing Fernando. So it does take time to get up to that level again. And you look back to when Michael Schumacher returned to Formula One. Fernando isn't doing those kind of mistakes that Michael was doing because the cars have changed so much in those 4 or 5 years until Michael returned, and Fernando's only been out for 2, where Lewis is only a few years younger, but he's not, well, at the moment, there's obviously no indication that he's going to step away from the sport. He's not going to take a couple of gap years. So he's keeping up and change with the changing cars as year on year.
And there's almost a sense with like those other drivers who were significantly older. I mean, let's not forget, by the time Fernando's contract finishes in 2022, the end of that season, assuming he doesn't sign another one, he'll still be younger than Michael Schumacher was when he actually returned to Mercedes in 2010. So there is definitely a correlation there between age and obviously ability behind the wheel, but perhaps that's exacerbated even more by the fact that they both took time out of the sport before eventually returning to a new era. It's not like they're returning to the cars that they left. You know, things have changed in Formula One, as they often do quite quickly. In Lewis's case, he seems to embrace these challenges and get better each time. And we'll have to wait and see if he does sign a new deal beyond this season, whether that remains the case with the new cars. We may see Lewis's performance dip, but it's certainly an exciting prospect. And I think a lot of us would agree that it would be great to see the champ in one of those cars next season, duking it out with so many people on what could potentially be an equal playing field, perhaps the most equal we've ever seen in Formula One. So we'll have to wait and see how that story develops. And of course, if Lewis does sign a new deal, I'll certainly be looking forward to seeing how he gets on. And of course, how much more can he achieve in the sport? It's unprecedented. I don't think we're ever going to see anything like this again. I mean, I said that with Schumacher, but, you know, Hamilton come along. So who knows? What do I know? But let's move on to the next story, of course. Guys, let us know what you think in the comments below regarding Lewis Hamilton. Do you want him to stay in the sport beyond 2021? Do you not? Let us know why. And of course, if he does stay, will you be excited to see how he gets on? And how do you think he'll deal with the new cars? So much to look forward to and talk about. But let's talk about the second seat at Mercedes. Now, for a while now, we've felt that Valtteri Bottas' time in that Mercedes number 2 seat is starting to come to an end. Will it come to an end at the end of this season? Most people believe that it will. If it does, the question remains, who's going to replace him? Now, for a long time, the obvious answer seemed to be George Russell. However, the last couple of months, this season in particular, we've started to see signs that perhaps Mercedes are considering other options. It seemed for all the world that after the Sakir Grand Prix that George was destined to be in that Mercedes alongside Lewis Hamilton in this case, which I believe was perhaps what Mercedes would want. But they seem to be exploring other options. Now, Toto Wolff gave an interview to the Italian version of motorsport.com the other day. So I'm going to read a few quotes from this interview. And on the Bottas-Russell development, he mentioned that Valtteri is our driver and that he's always loyal to the drivers, but we have the duty to evaluate the future and have long-term plans for the team, especially since we have 2 junior drivers, make that 2, Esteban Ocon and George Russell. We have to evaluate everything. Now, guys, when I first read this comment, I was very surprised because I had no idea Esteban Ocon was still a part of the Mercedes program. May not necessarily legally be a part of the team, but clearly he is in the plans and the mindset of Toto Wolff when making his decision. And I guess given what we've seen the last couple of weeks with Williams and with George Russell in particular, especially at the Imola Grand Prix with that collision with Valtteri Bottas, Lee, do you feel that there's now a real seed of doubt in Toto Wolff's mind that perhaps George Russell is not doing enough to convince him that he is an appropriate replacement for Valtteri Bottas for next season?
Oh, I think there probably is a seed of doubt that George may not be the best viable option. Fernando is a known quantity, right? He may not be a skill set, but he's been around and they know what Fernando can achieve in a car. And as I said a few minutes ago, Esteban is taking it to Fernando so far this season. Right? Fernando may improve as the season goes on, but so far, Esteban has got the measure of Fernando. And he could have been looking at George last year going, oh, that's Sakir, that was really good. But now he's like, oh, Esteban, he's really beating Fernando. You're only as good as your last race. So Esteban is doing it at the right time. And I mean, unfortunately for George, Williams is at the wrong end of the grid. All right, Alpine isn't fighting for, on the verge for the top of midfield, depending on the track and especially their recent form. So it's the best time for Esteban to be doing these performances and showing up Fernando. And George can be Mr. Saturday all he wants, but he doesn't get the chance to do the Sunday performance where it counts.
I mean, for all we know, this could be just smoke and mirrors with Toto Wolff, obviously, looking after Esteban Ocon, but perhaps with his future with Alpine uncertain at this time, this may be just a way for Toto to try and force Alpine to tie Esteban down to a longer deal to keep him in Formula One. Of course, we've said for a while that Alpine have been looking at Pierre Gasly as a potential replacement for Ocon. Alonso has a 2-year deal, which would be rather expensive to buy him out of that at the end of this season for a year. I'm pretty sure it would be. And Fernando isn't going to want to give up that seat without being bought out of it. And even then, it might not be enough. So, this could all be just a ploy for Toto Wolff to keep one of the drivers he used to look after in Formula One. And let's be honest, Esteban Ocon this season, despite what we thought last season, has been incredibly impressive. One of the drivers of the season. And as you said, Lee, he's emphatically been dominating Fernando Alonso, particularly in the races. I think in qualifying, is he 4-0 or is it 3-1 to Esteban this season? I can't quite remember.
I can't remember, I'm afraid.
I mean, let us know in the comments, guys. But he's ahead of Fernando in qualifying as well as the race. So, all the signs are there that Esteban definitely should be in Formula One. He's making a very good case to stay in Alpine, but perhaps the Mercedes links, as I said, I've already marked them down as perhaps smoke and mirrors or a negotiation tactic, but there might be some truth into this. I mean, Esteban was linked with Mercedes for a long time. He was next in line to take over from Bottas or Hamilton. Of course, things happened at Force India, Racing Point, obviously when that happened when they went into administration. And of course, he lost his seat at Renault when Ricciardo made that shock switch in 2018. So, now that he's come back and shown a brilliant level of performance this season, all of a sudden, he may end up in that Mercedes seat. And as you pointed out, Lee, it's so difficult to judge George Russell's performance in the Williams against a guy who is regularly competing in the points and qualifying in the top 5 in the last couple of races. Courtney, I'm going to bring you into this discussion as well, because I've said quite a lot on this already, but do you feel that there's merit to judge Esteban Ocon with a more likely chance of getting that seat at Mercedes than George Russell by virtue of the fact that George is in a much less competitive car than Esteban? Or do you feel that Toto Wolff kind of has to give some allowances to George Russell because of the performance deficit that he currently faces compared to Esteban Ocon in an Alpine?
Well, I think the previous links that Ocon has with Mercedes and even Toto Wolff on a personal level certainly does give him more of a chance compared to other drivers. Because look, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which driver you are, which team you drive for. If you're performing well, you're going to be catching the attention of the bigger teams looking on to next season. And I think it's pretty out there that Bottas is likely to be replaced. So Mercedes will be keeping their options open. And yeah, if Ocon carries on the way he's going, he will certainly be an option. But I think one thing that really needs to be stressed here, I think it's time for George Russell to get out of Williams. He's done everything that he can for that team. They don't seem to be developing at the rate that George needs. We all know how brutal Formula One can be. Drivers can be forgotten so quickly. So if Russell continues to be in a car where he can't really showcase his talent, it could start becoming almost forgotten and lose his real chance to compete with a top team. So he really needs to be. I think George needs to sort of put himself out there. You know what? I want to lead Williams, and if it's not with Mercedes, it could be someone else. Because I remember there were rumours last season that even Red Bull would check seeing the situation, because Perez hasn't started well. I do expect Perez to stay at Red Bull, but if for whatever reason Perez was to leave, maybe Russell could kind of put his name out there for other teams such as Red Bull. So I think next season needs to be the season where George does move on, whether it is with Mercedes or someone else.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to bring Red Bull into this because, of course, in my opinion, if Perez wasn't able to make the cut and they got rid of him, which I don't think is going to happen, then I would suspect they'd look towards Alex Albon if they felt he was ready to come back, or maybe someone from outside the Red Bull program. Because right now, Gasly, they don't want Gasly in that car. They don't want Gasly in the AlphaTauri, let alone the Red Bull. And Yuki Tsunoda already hasn't exactly demonstrated, other than in Bahrain, that he'd be quick enough to be in that Red Bull seat. So he's certainly, it's going to be a while before Yuki would be in contention for that. I suppose we should be asking the question, because we've assumed that George Russell is the natural successor for Mercedes, the natural successor to Lewis Hamilton. But in your opinions, guys, do you feel that George Russell at this point has done enough to convince Mercedes that he should be in that seat alongside Lewis Hamilton? Lee, I'll ask you that one first.
I think he's done enough to at least be considered, which he probably is one of Toto's options. And unlike, look at Esteban and what he's doing against Fernando, George has been in the car last year. George has worked in the team. We know what he's done in qualifying. We know what he's done in the race. It was only sheer bad luck that George didn't win in the Sakura Grand Prix. So he's a known quantity to Mercedes more than Esteban. So I think he's done enough to at least be given the opportunity.
And how about you, Cole?
Yeah, I think the situation with George is that his frustrations over this whole situation are starting to show on track. I'm not saying that's correct from his perspective that that's even happening, because obviously you should be holding your emotions back, particularly when you're in an elite sport like Formula One. But again, as I've already said, he has to be looking to move on, and I still do believe it'd be Mercedes. As you've already said, Lee, he has experience in the team, and I mean, look at that impact he made. Like, I know Sakira's spoken about a lot. He's thrown out there a lot, but we can't forget how much of an impact he made in such a short space of time. So I still think he'll be probably the first choice if Bottas wants to go. But yeah, as I said already, I think if he doesn't go to Mercedes, he needs to move on for his sake, because we can't forget how much of a good driver George Russell is. And it's so easy to forget that when you're driving for a team that isn't performing well enough. Absolutely.
But unfortunately for George, he's kind of in that perilous position where he's only really been able to demonstrate his ability in one race in his Formula One career, and that was in Sakir. And of course, he should have won that race. If we weren't for the issues Mercedes had, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. George would probably be already signed up maybe, and that, he's already demonstrated that. But unfortunately, one race, it's like Alex Albon last season. He had one great race at Abu Dhabi at the end of the season, but it doesn't make up for several performances where he was below par. And who's to say that George may have been in the Mercedes a full season and had a similar season? You can't tell. One thing Mercedes do have is evidence from other drivers that they're looking at. Another driver we should throw into this discussion as well is Lando Norris. Now, it's obvious that Mercedes want a successor to Lewis Hamilton that's a young driver that isn't currently in a race-winning car, so we can forget Max Verstappen at this point in time. I think he's tied to Red Bull for the foreseeable future. Maybe in the future, 4 or 5 years down the line, it might be an option, but we'll have to wait and see how that goes. So right now, Lando Norris is potentially a realistic candidate. Now, before we started recording, Lee, you pointed out to me in 2019 that he was signed up to Mercedes management, not necessarily in the same breadth as George Russell and Esteban Ocon were in this case, but Mercedes were keeping tabs on him nonetheless. And of course, this engine deal that McLaren have with Mercedes does create an extra avenue to perhaps make the transition from McLaren to Mercedes a lot smoother than perhaps it would be if Mercedes were signing him from another random team on the grid. With that all being said, and given the amazing start to the season that Lando Norris has made, do you feel that he could potentially be the natural successor at Mercedes, not just for Bottas, but for Lewis Hamilton in the future? And Courtney, I'll ask you that one first.
Yeah, why not? He's already showing he has the pedigree to do it. Season after season, he's making good strides. I think even from a marketing perspective, I'm sure it's been noticed how popular Lando is. So if you put the two things together, a fast driver is also popular. You've got all the hallmarks of a future star there. So there's no reason for Lando not to be an option, but I still believe it will be George. But in the coming years, could you imagine if you had the Lando Norris-George Russell partnership? I think the Brits would love that.
Well, it'll certainly be in good hands in the future. Absolutely. I'm sure Sky Sports and BBC and Channel 4, they'll be all over that story, as the rest of us would be, and that would be fun to watch. Lee, I've got to ask the same question to you as well. Do you feel that there is a realistic chance that perhaps Lando Norris could end up in that seat?
I don't. I think his talent could merit being looked at that seat, but I don't think realistically he'll be the first to be there. He's had a great start to the season, but as Toto Wolff has said, he has loyalty to his drivers, and Esteban. I didn't know he was still a junior driver, but Toto has considered him still to be one of Mercedes drivers, and George, I would think, would be considered higher up as a junior driver than Lando. But Lando could definitely be the wild card. And you know what wild cards happen, that Sergio Perez was a wild card for Red Bull. You wouldn't have said this time last year, or we weren't racing this time last year, but you wouldn't have said Sergio would be racing for Red Bull next year. You wouldn't even put it as a wild card options, and Sergio's got Red Bull, so never say never in the world of Formula One.
Yeah, absolutely. And, let's not forget that, you're right to point out Perez, but Lando obviously at the moment is performing the best of the British drivers. And of course, the drivers that we've mentioned so far, excluding Valtteri Bottas, is getting, the best results. And you could also argue that he does have the best car underneath him. So it's obviously a bit easier for him to perform as well as he is doing compared to someone like George Russell, who's struggling to even get a championship point. So there's so many factors to take into consideration. And of course, as I said, whilst Lando's performing well, we can't discount George for obvious reasons. But Lando is regularly demonstrating that he's able to get good results in a good car, as is Ocon of late. George, unfortunately, whilst being handicapped with the Williams, with all due respect to them, there's no evidence to suggest that he can actually do that job better than the other two. So it's a real hard decision for Toto Wolff. And I think we shouldn't forget either that whilst I genuinely believe that Toto is very loyal to his drivers and looks after them, the Mercedes Academy hasn't exactly brought too many drivers into their top team. I mean, yes, you could argue that Lewis Hamilton technically is a Mercedes driver from their ranks, but that was more down to Ron Dennis and McLaren getting him involved rather than Mercedes himself, even though he was part of the Mercedes program. And Valtteri Bottas as well, technically speaking, who he was looked after by Toto's wife, Susie Wolff, at Williams, and obviously got him in that seat Mercedes. But other than those two circumstances, you can see Ferrari have obviously been promoting drivers into their team. They've got Charles Leclerc into their team, and obviously doing work with Mick Schumacher and Giovinazzi. Red Bull obviously have a huge history of having a conveyor belt of drivers going into their teams for the last 20 years. So for Mercedes, my point is that it's not uncommon for them to rather look outside their academy rather than focus on promoting drivers within. I suppose the big problem for that is because they don't really have a halfway house team anymore, do they? I mean, you could argue Racing Point were that, but I don't think Aston Martin are going to be that anymore. And naturally, you'd want George to probably jump in that car if there was a seat there, but I can't see that happening, to be honest. But I digress. I was going to wait for one of you guys to just jump in there. But
sorry.
So it's not often that I go quiet to give you guys the floor without announcing it. But I just
I
figured
know you caught us off guard there.
This will get a lot easier when we're in person doing this together. This will get a whole lot easier. Otherwise, it's just going to be me looking at you guys going, whenever you're ready, guys, jump in. But I digress. But guys, let us know who you think is going to be in that Mercedes seat next year. Let's not forget Valtteri Bottas is an option and has been the favourable option the last 4 or 5 years. But you get the same thing with Valtteri Bottas, who's not necessarily bad, but Mercedes now probably have to look long term rather than, a driver that's going to back up Lewis, because they need to think beyond that. So we'll have to wait and see. But let us know who you think, guys. Will it be Valtteri keeping his seat for another year? Will it be George Russell, as many of us hope it will be? Or perhaps someone like Ocon or even Lando Norris or another driver? Put another driver in there below. I will not be taking anyone that puts Maldonado or Ranganathan seriously. I certainly won't be taking anyone that puts Mazepin seriously. This ain't drift racing, so I think we can ignore that. But get your names in below. Let us know who you think is going to be in that Mercedes seat. Who do you want to be in that Mercedes seat would be a nice change of pace as well.
Adam, just want to add, where you mentioned Pastor Maldonado, he has got the 100% pole to win ratio. I mean, not many drivers can boast that record.
No,
what's he,
and it's 8 years to the day, I believe, that the GOAT himself won the Spanish Grand Prix, if memory serves. I think today or yesterday. Yeah. So quite apt that you brought that up.
It's like you knew subconsciously, Lee.
He always gets a mention in these episodes, Pastor Maldonado, through scripted or through virtue. He just belongs in the discussion. Of course, Pastor does. We love him. There will never be anyone like him. But let's move on to the next story, guys. So there's been talk as well about McLaren and what's been going on with them. Now, throughout this week, McLaren held a secret event where they invited a select group of journalists. Unfortunately, we weren't prestigious enough to be invited, or our invitation got lost in the post. Make of that what you will. We forgive you, McLaren, so don't worry. But they made a special announcement to these journalists and media outlets with the with the agreement that they would allow McLaren to make this announcement official on Sunday. So obviously they wanted to create some buzz around what this announcement is going to be, but obviously not let people know what exactly it's going to be until they want to announce it. I'm going to let open the floor up, guys, here. What do we think this announcement is going to be? What do we think McLaren have planned? And apparently, according to them, it's very, very exciting.
I'm going to say Formula E. That's what my gut is telling me. It makes sense. We've seen other manufacturers like Mercedes get involved, and McLaren is certainly a big name in the sports car world. So it would make a lot of sense for them to do that. And it would also encourage more fans of Formula One to join Formula E, because I've no doubt that Mercedes joining Formula E helped with that. So having teams like McLaren following suit will not only be good for McLaren as a team, but also be good for Formula E. We're looking at motorsport being more environmentally friendly. So having big teams joining Formula E is only a good thing. So it'd make perfect sense for that to happen.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I'm sort of in and out with Formula E. Like, I'll watch it sometimes. There was a great race at Monaco last weekend with Lucas Di Grassi and Mitch Evans having a great battle in that race. If you guys had seen it, or if anyone else had seen it, it was a brilliant fight there. And of course, they were racing on the full layout for the first time, which was quite cool to see as well. But with the Gen 3 cars being unveiled next season, it's not really a long shot that McLaren are probably going to throw their hat into the ring. They've probably been doing a lot of work in the past. There's been rumours and links to McLaren joining Formula E, as Mercedes have done in the past, and I'm sure other manufacturers will look to get involved at some point. So there really is a real drive for sustainability in motorsport, and Formula E is definitely one of the leading contenders for that. Lee, you're the resident Formula E fan out of the three of us. What do you make of this announcement from McLaren that's coming on Sunday? Do you think it's Formula E? And if it is, how would you think that would go for them?
Yeah, my bet would be it's Formula E. I know they've talked about or looking at it, and so other manufacturers like Ferrari have looked at it, and Ferrari have said it's too early in the championship development to put their hat in the ring. But a team like McLaren be willing to get in not that McLaren is less prestigious than Ferrari, but just the youthful energy that they now have under this management compared to like Ron Dennis, where he's clinical. But I think it's the likely thing for McLaren to do. But with Formula E, because obviously they're the maximum amount of teams that they can have in the sport under the current rules, it will probably be a joining of resources of an existing team, like they did with the IndyCar and joining with the Arrow squad. So I'm not too sure what team I would say they're joining up, because there are a couple of independents that buy powertrains from manufacturers. So it could easily be McLaren join up with an existing team and manufacture their own powertrain for that team. So that's definitely going to be an interesting announcement to see on Sunday.
I mean, does it seem inevitable that Formula E is going to end up becoming a manufacturer team sport? Because, we already had some manufacturer teams. We had Audi in there, for example. Mercedes have obviously thrown their hat in recently. We have Jaguar Renault as well. Yeah, Renault as well. We had Jaguar as well chucking their name in. It seems that we're getting a lot more teams that are manufacturer teams. Of course, we had, some other teams like Techeetah, Mahindra, Virgin were obviously involved for a time. And I just feel that Formula E is becoming more of a manufacturer sport. I mean, how do you feel about this one, Lee? Do you feel that eventually it's going to become all manufacturers? I mean, you mentioned Ferrari looking at it, but perhaps they're waiting for the technology to become a lot more developed to the point where they don't necessarily have to build Formula E up. They can just come in and add their name to it once it's ready.
Yeah, I think it's going to become a completely manufacturer dominated, because the overhead costs of running a car or a team in Formula E is a lot lower than Formula One. Obviously, there's no aero development race because they're standard cars, so that cuts out a massive chunk of development. They have a certain amount that the teams, I think it's slightly budget limited on what teams can spend on their powertrains. And obviously the FIA, now it's an actual FIA championship, has specified what can be developed on the powertrain and what could be opened up in future seasons. So they have a long-term plan for the championship. But it's a fraction of the cost compared to Formula One. And especially, as you said, about sustainability, and the manufacturers are now looking at electric cars as being a potential forward for the motor industry as a whole. They're going to want to develop their powertrains and display their electric technology to the world effectively in free advertising. Right, it doesn't have the same market as Formula One does, and the sheer audience doesn't even get close to Formula One, which I think is why I can't remember who suggested it, but maybe they said that maybe Formula E should be used as a support race for Formula One to try and ride off Formula One's glove tails, which sort of goes against the Formula E mythology of a lot of circuit street races compared to circuit-based races. But definitely a very much watch this space sport.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And, there are some manufacturers that probably look at Formula E and think, it's not a good time to join it now, but obviously it will get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's always improving all the time. And a lot of high caliber drivers are in that sport. I mean, Mercedes, for example, have Stoffel Van Dorn in there with Pascal Wehrlein and sorry, not Pascal, but Nick de Vries. Yeah, Nick de Vries. I mean, Pascal Wehrlein drives for the, oh man, what team does he drive for, Lee? I forget. Is it the
Mahindra?
Yeah, I want to say Mahindra, but I don't want to come across as an absolute noob and forget, because I know he's in that sort of team. But
isn't Felipe Massa in it?
He was driving for Venturi last season. I can't remember if he's still involved.
I know he's in it at one point.
I actually can't recall.
Yeah, it changes so much all the time. Yeah. I mean, obviously, you got Lucas Di Grassi, defending champion as well, and obviously John-Eric Verne doing great things in the sport as well. A lot of former Formula One drivers, very talented drivers in that sport. So it's only going to get bigger and bigger, and maybe we will see Ferrari in there and perhaps a few other manufacturers join that sport sooner rather than later. I mean, Ferrari are concentrating on their hypercar entry into the World Endurance Championship, which we may see some Formula One drivers be involved in that, maybe at Le Mans as well. So we'll have to wait and see. But of course, guys, we're talking about McLaren in this regard. So we'll have to wait and see on Sunday what they announce. Let us know what you think is going to be. Do you think it's going to be Formula E, or perhaps do you think they're going to be doing something else? I can't think off the top of my head what else it could be, but we'll have to wait and see what's been going on. But watch this space with McLaren. Last thing I think we should talk about is the rumours now starting to intensify regarding the Turkish Grand Prix future. Now, on Twitter, we said, I think it was the other week, we mentioned that because the UK had added Turkey to the red list for travel, in other words, you can't travel there and travel can't come here, it did cast a huge doubt over whether or not the Turkish Grand Prix was going to be able to take place on the 13th of June, that weekend, which originally was meant to be the Canadian Grand Prix. So obviously the sub for that one is now having its own problems. The reason why this is an issue, guys, is because 9 of the 10 teams have a base in the UK, which of course means that they will not be able to travel to Turkey from the UK. The only team that would is Ferrari. So if they do have a Turkish Grand Prix, it looks like Ferrari will win a race this season. Almost like Indianapolis 2005. You get rid of the competition, Ferrari will win a race. But yeah, of course, at this point, it does seem extremely likely that we're not going to have a Turkish Grand Prix, unfortunately, which is a shame because it produced a brilliant race last season. Of course, the venue where Lewis Hamilton confirmed his 7th World Championship. But that being said, there are a few circuits that are being lined up to replace it. Stefano Domenicali, the new CEO at Formula One, has mentioned that in a statement the other day, he did say that it's likely that the plan B, or plan C, if you like, almost has as many plans as the Ferrari race engineers these days. It seems that we're going to be going to perhaps a circuit that is owned by a current team. So on the list, we've got Austria, Mugello, possibly Hockenheim as well. Guys, I'm going to come to you on this one. Lee, first of all, what are your thoughts regarding the potential for the Turkish Grand Prix being cancelled, and which circuit would you like to see be added to the calendar in its place?
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably going to be likely, unfortunately, that the Turkish Grand Prix is going to be cancelled, because otherwise no team will want to pay for the hotel quarantine return to the UK, and no engineer wants to be on the road for 2 weeks because they can't return to the UK while they ride out effectively the 2-week period of their last entry in Turkey. So I just don't think that's going to happen just for the teams. But as manufacturers, I know it's not in Europe, but Suzuka's still owned by Honda, and Honda are still in the sport. Not that they're going to fly to Japan, as much as Honda would love to probably do races in Suzuka. But I personally would like Hockenheim more than Maranello. I just think Hockenheim is a better track personally. But I think it's probably going to be more of a rearrangement, or maybe there'll be a back-to-back, as you said before. We started recording is the
was that Austria?
Austria, yeah. That's another alternative. Personally, I'm not a fan of Maranello compared to Hockenheim.
Yeah, I mean, the Mugello race was cool to watch in qualifying, but the race itself, it had its moments, but it was a very hard track to pass on, and that's not going to change this season. It was certainly remembered for certain shock moments, like that huge crash behind the safety car, Ferrari's 1000th race and the livery they brought to that event, and of course Alex Albon's first podium for Red Bull. We shouldn't forget that as well, because that was a pretty big day for him. But you're right, Lee, I would love to see Hockenheim back on the calendar. It's a shame it wasn't on last year's calendar, although we did get a race at the Nürburgring for the Eiffel Grand Prix, which was pretty cool. But it would be nice to see it there. I'm with you on this one. As I said earlier, I feel that we could end up with a double header in Austria, which, to facilitate that, all we'd have to do is you leave that slot empty where Turkey would have been, and then obviously you go from Azerbaijan to the French Grand Prix a couple of weeks after that, and then you'll just have a double header back-to-back in Austria. So you'd have Austria and then perhaps another Styrian Grand Prix like we got last season, and then go to Silverstone a week after that one. So we'll have to wait and see. Some people have been saying Austria does seem like the likely candidate. I think if they have another race added in there, the teams might prefer logistically to not have to travel too far. But that being said, that doesn't exactly rule out Hockenheim either, because they're not too far from Geneva. So obviously, and Vienna, sorry, I should say, not Geneva. where the race is held there. So it wouldn't be too far at all. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. I'm sure either solution would be good. Let us know in the comments below, guys, which race you prefer to have added instead of Turkey. Courtney, we should get your thoughts on this one as well quickly.
Personally, I'd be against a double header. I think one of the reasons why it worked last season was because we were just happy to see some kind of racing and for us to see a full season. This season, we have potentially 23 races. So I just feel if we're going to have a slot empty, I think it'd be better if we go somewhere else, just given the circumstances that we're in right now.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. And, you know, to try and keep the calendar going as good as possible. I mean, we knew we were going to have obstacles this year. I think nobody expected us to have the full calendar as we expected it to be. And this is all happening in Europe. You know, some of the races outside of Europe that have had issues with COVID are still having these issues. So whilst we had a very much a European dominated calendar last season, there's no reason why that won't happen again this season. But hopefully, fingers crossed, we won't have too many more interruptions to the calendar other than this one that we're facing at the moment. And perhaps obviously a few of the races in the American region towards the end of the season. But let's hope that things go according to plan. I'm sure they know what they're doing at F1. They did a great job last season, so there's no reason why they won't be able to sort this out for this year as well. One more thing that we should talk about before we round this all off. Everybody's favorite topic, track limits. Now, this season, it's mad to think that on a race-by-race basis, one of the biggest talking points at every venue we've been to this season has been track limits, whether it was Bahrain, where we had Max Verstappen having to give up the win over to Lewis Hamilton, or potentially give up the win because of overtaking him at turn 4 outside track limits. We also had that same debate with Lewis Hamilton during the race, which of course we saw was illegal. We had track limits being changed around at Imola, at Agua Minerale, those corners there. We also had track limit stuff going on in the Portimao race where Max Verstappen lost his fastest lap. And of course, the many times deleted in FP1 and FP2, it was like over 100. It was absolutely crazy. And of course, you know, we had the same thing going on in Spain as well. So Formula One have kind of heard out the fans on this one, because I think we're all sick to death of talking about track limits. We're all sick to death of moaning about track limits. I think we're sick to death of hearing drivers complain about track limits, whether they're finding them too harsh or not finding them harsh enough. F1 have responded, and they are now setting up a working group to try and determine a pretty much straight line standard rule on track limits. Now, I'm going to be honest, guys. I don't see why this is such a big debate. I mean, call me old-fashioned, but I just feel the track limits should be defined by the white lines around the circuit. And that if you have all 4 wheels off the circuit, or outside the white line, your lap time gets deleted, or you get a warning in the race, etc., etc. I mean, Lee, I'm going to ask you first, because I can see you nodding your head as I'm ranting about this, but I'm guessing you harbour similar feelings to me on this one. But if you were part of this working group, how would you determine what track limits, or how would you define what track limits is?
I completely agree that it should just be the white lines. In the current rules, they say the track limits are the white lines. You don't see in other sports that have lines demarking the area of playing. You're going to use football here. If the ball goes over the white lines at the end of the field, it's out of play. You can't, I've got my foot within the field, I can dribble outside the field. No, you're off the pitch. It doesn't work. It's the same in basketball. It'll be the same in cricket and in baseball. It's just doesn't work when you keep changing the limitations of what's acceptable. Because obviously some tracks, it's like, oh, you can go over the white lines here, you can't go over the white lines there. Or you can use the curb here, you can't use the curb there. Or you can't go beyond that curb here, but you can go beyond that. And it's frustrating for the drivers to learn all the rules because they just want to go fast as they can. And it's frustrating for the fans because they don't always understand when the drivers lose their lap times, they get deleted or have to hand back places. And it's just extra hassle. You just keep the rules, you define it, keep it the same everywhere, and you have the lines. And I do agree. I don't see why it's so hard for the Formula One to just go, okay, this makes sense.
Yeah, it's nuts because as far as I see it, you use other sports as an example, but I think what's annoyed people and what's annoyed me as well as a fan of this is that you watch race weekends and you're explained to about track limits. You're told where the limits are and you're like, okay, that's fine. I've got no problem that you're literally designating where the track limits are. That's what we're going to keep an eye out for this weekend. But the problem is that they'll mark out track limits for qualifying or for practice, but then they'll change throughout the race. It's like we had this in Bahrain where turn 4, you weren't allowed to go beyond the white line or have all 4 wheels off the white line or your lap time be deleted. But then in the race, we had like you could go outside the white lines on a normal lap, like as Lewis Hamilton did like for half the laps of the race. And Max Verstappen obviously forgot because all the drivers are made aware. But then as soon as Max goes around the outside to overtake, it's illegal. Now, whilst I agree with that, I don't understand why we're changing the rules from one day to another and we're not just keeping it consistent. And I think that's annoyed fans more than the actual where do you define track limits. Courtney, I see you know, you're nodding your head at this. I've got to bring you into this one. I mean, where do you stand on this track limits debate? And also, where would you like to define it if you were part of this working group?
Well, it needs to be black and white, as a pair of you have already stated, because what we're starting to see in Formula One is something that we're already suffering with greatly in football with VAR. You know, it's all well and good having a debate, but like if you're going into every single race talking about track limits, it does start becoming a bit tedious. You want to be talking about the actual racing. You know, we've seen it in football where you'll have like some great games ruined or the story be completely taken over by a VAR incident, even though the rules are still set in stone. And it comes down to human error, really. And from not only VAR perspective, but then also the track limits. If you just set it out, you know, white is white, black is black, then that's it. That's the way it should be. I think if you just keep on creating these grey areas, it just creates a bit of a volatile situation up within the teams, because at the end of the day, they want to be number one, so they're going to do whatever it takes to win. You need to set out the rules for the sake of the teams and for the fans as well.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And, you know, as you said, in other sports, you don't just change the rules to suit a particular narrative or depending on where you are. I mean, in football, you know, it is as clear as day. You've got, you know, if you foul someone, it's a free kick. If you handball, it's a handball. If you trip over a Man United player, it's a penalty. You know, all of that stuff. It's consistent across the board. Whether you like it or not, you know, Courtney enjoys what I did there. It's always an old joke, but it's still relevant every single time. And if we had as many penalties in football as we did in Formula One, I'm sure Bruno Fernandes would fancy a career in that sport. But that being said, you can tell I'm an Arsenal fan. But that being said, you know, Formula One, I don't understand the inconsistencies. It's not a new thing. They've had this for so long. I just think in the last couple of years, because the track limits have been defined for everyone, they've had the safety car driving around and they highlight in the zones of where you can go versus where you can't. But then they change their mind throughout the weekend without letting people know. That's when it gets a bit silly. And I think fans are just getting bored now of half of these races being determined or decided by track limits, or half the talking points like Verstappen's fastest lap being taken away from him because he exceeded track limits. And I'm like, well, yeah, he did. So what? You know, take the fastest lap off of him. It's not a legal lap time. And I've got no problem with that. But you can't, you know, pick and change where you want it to or to suit whatever, because then you can't have like turn 1, you can't go there. At turn 2, you can't go there. Just keep it consistent, guys. And these are the best drivers in the world. So I don't see why they struggle to keep it within the white lines, because what you'll end up with is what we had, I think it was an IndyCar race at the Circuit of Americas a few years ago. I think it was like 2019 or 2018, where the old turn 13, where it's the left-hander before the final corner, and there's that runoff area on the outside, but it's much faster to just keep going wide as you can. And they were literally manipulating that. It was so funny to watch how wide they were going, because it opens up the final corner, but it was legal. And in Formula One, if you let the drivers define the limits, that's what you're going to get. You're going to end up seeing laps where they're all just driving across here, driving across there. It's like one of them YouTube videos where there's no rules. You just drive all over the place on F1 2020 or something crazy like that. As fun as that would be to see, I don't think that's what really the fans would want. They just want something consistent and, you know, challenge these drivers. That's what they paid the big money for. Rant over. I could go on for ages, like showing my age here, just ranting on like a grumpy old man. But yeah, let us know what you guys think about track limits and that. As fun a topic as it is, hopefully whatever this working group decides will provide some clarity and, more importantly, consistency on the rules, so that we'll be talking about track limits a lot less than we currently do right now, because I don't think anyone enjoys talking about this particular thing. But that's pretty much all the time that we've got for this one, actually. We've got quite a lot a lot of news to cover. Thank you, Lee, of course, for joining us once again and offering your insight.
No problem. Thank you for having me again.
And as always, Courtney, thank you for offering your expertise as well on these topics.
Always a pleasure, mate. And it's always good having you on, Lee. You're always welcome to come back whenever you please, mate.
All right. Thank you very much, Courtney.
We need to get you a DNF1 shirt. You might as well be part of the team anyway. Not enough. But that being said, guys, of course, there's so many topics going on, but let us know what you think of those. And of course, if you have enjoyed this discussion, please do like the episode. The likes that you give us on YouTube, they're really helping get our content out to plenty of people that obviously don't get to see it because they don't know much about us. So of course, it allows us to be exposed to the world of YouTube, and of course helps to bring more people into the discussion, and of course allows more people to enjoy our great content, which we really enjoy making for you. And of course, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're really grateful for everyone that has subscribed so far, and there's plenty of room for this DNF1 family to keep growing and growing into the millions. Hopefully one day. Probably a bit ambitious, but you never know. I want that gold plaque on the back of my wall. I'm sure we'll get one for everybody. How about that? We'll say YouTube. Yeah, we've got a million. We got a million hosts on this channel. We'll send one out to everybody. I'm sure YouTube won't mind. But that being said, guys, as always, thank you so much for tuning in. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 podcast, which will be the Monaco Grand Prix preview. So till then, take care.
See you soon.